Dear students, in this lecture we are going to discuss about the TBT agreement. So, we completed the SPS agreement in the last 2 classes, and SPS and TBT agreement goes together, because the SPS agreement talked about the food safety, animal safety, plant safety, and the TBT agreement is going to talk about you can say that the labeling issues and also the packaging issues. And also in this class we will see that SPS versus TBT, that means what is the difference between these two measures, and what is SPS and what is TBT, and how it is distinguished specifically. So, we can see that what is this TBT and technical barriers to trade. So, technical barriers to trade discipline, which talks about and definitely the Uruguay round is not the first agreement on TBT. So, you can find provisions in the GATT agreement as well, which talked about, yes, is commonly known as the standard code. So, in the GATT, which you can see built upon the provisions of previous GATT agreements. So, which was created in 1995, that means the Tokyo Round Code was played a crucial role in the formation of the Uruguay Round Code, that is the present TBT agreement. So, and also you can see that the standard code which was developed in the Tokyo Round Code is the forerunner, and most of the provisions are adopted in the Uruguay Round negotiations. And we can see that the GATT provisions very clearly talks about 3, article 11 and article 20, which talks about the standard codes, the code on technical barriers to trade, but the only problem was this code was adopted by in 1979, this code was only adopted by 32 countries. There were only 32 signatories. So, it means that this agreement was not very popular, because people find it very difficult to comply with this agreement, or they fear that these labeling standards or packaging standards are going to damage their prospects of export to other countries. So, the 1979 code, which talks about technical regulations, standards and conformity assessment procedures, which do not create any barrier to international trade. And again, like SPS, it gives the discretion to the member countries to protect animal health, plant health, and also food safety standards. And the only exceptions which are given is the national security exceptions. So, and also to look into the policy interest of each and every country. So, TBT agreement very clearly, the purpose of the TBT agreement is clearly says, the WTO itself it says, avoiding unnecessary discriminatory obstacles to international trade, and that is the common purpose of all agreements. And secondly, members' right to regulate to protect legitimate interest. So, the TBT agreement gives the discretion to the member countries to come out with their own standards. So, its aim is very clear. Technical regulations and standards should not become a barrier to trade, and these measures, especially technical regulations, should be implemented on the principle of non-discriminatory basis. And the WTO members' discretion or legitimate freedom to implement policies and objectives are given, or even to protect the environment is given to the member countries. You adopt measures, it is not going to violate the TBT agreement, but that should be adopted in conformity with the assessment procedures in the TBT agreement. So, again the TBT agreement also encourages the members to adopt international standards developed by these international organizations, and international transparency provisions are very important and crucial in this the TBT agreement as well. So, here it covers technical regulations, voluntary standards and procedures, other procedures to supplement the SPS agreement. And the prominent is the technical regulations and voluntary standards. So, its purpose is very clear and it determines the technical regulations, technical standards, especially the packaging and labeling, and but it should be in conformity with the SPS agreement as well. And TBT measures always, for example, is looking into the technical standards of every product. The simple example is every fan in India has to be an ISI mark, Indian Standard Institution mark, energy mark. So, at the same time you can find certain star marking in air conditioners, they are voluntary marks. So, ISI mark for every electric equipment like whether it is fan or it is an iron box, these are mandatory standards. At the same time the star marking is a voluntary standard, it will come under the TBT agreement, and other standards for pharmaceutical products. Labeling requirements of cigarettes, labeling requirements in a liquor bottle, in an alcoholic liquor bottle, labeling requirements in food products, the protein content or it is cholesterol content is a general energy content, and these prescriptions are TBT measures, and every countries have domestic legislations as well. And other examples which you can see is emission standards. So, now we can see that emission standards Euro 1, 2, 3 or 4 or 5, 6 even. Then nutritious content of food packets, then the standard for recycling paper and plastic, the standards like testing standards, testing and certification is another area under the TBT. Like I already talked about the ISI marks, ISO marks, these are all will come under the TBT agreement. So, when it comes to labeling requirements, the nutritional claims of food products, quality and packaging, for example, packaging regulations of tobacco products, the packaging regulations of is alcoholic products, the packaging regulations with regard to plastics. So, this is not a sanitary phytosanitary measure, this is a TBT measure. So, all the regulations, for example, microbiological contamination of food, this is specifically or the pesticide residue in veterinary ducts, these are SPS measures, and packaging and labeling requirements are TBT measures. So, we may see the distinction between these two. So, here if you look into, we were talking about whether it is an SPS measure or it is a TBT measure. So, if you take food, drink, feed and its objectives. So, we can say one is human life, affecting human life. So, additives, contaminant, toxins, disease causing organisms for food, drink, plant or animal carry diseases. These are SPS measures. Then you can see animal life, again additives, contaminants, the same affecting animal and plant also is related to SPS measures. Pest diseases and all these disease causing organisms which is related to SPS measure. At the same time, pest entering and also technical regulations, standards, and whether a product contain a standard or technical regulation, and that is related to TBT. And also we will see more about the distinguishing between these two. So, here both SPS and TBT agreements encourages the use of international standards, but the SPS agreement scientific justification is required and risk assessment, a thorough risk assessment is to be made under the SPS agreement. So, TBT agreement, the governments decide the international standards. So, maybe they need not to adopt international standards because of it may be due to the geographical problems, geographical factors, or it is due to technological problems or other reasons. The government may not decide, the government may decide that the international standards may not applicable to, but the agreement, TBT agreement, the WTO encourages the people to adopt the international standards, but the governments have the freedom to say no to it. Then also you can see that the TBT regulations must be an exception. You can see during showing the national security reasons or prevention of deceptive practices, technical regulations can be imposed. They can introduced on national security basis or national security reasons and deceptive practices, the government can impose additional TBT measures. And also you can see that whether it is a measure, sanitary measure or it is a phytosanitary measure, it is very easy to decide. So, the criteria are very simple. If it is anything related to food, animal health or plant health, it is an SPS measure. If it is related to a technical regulation, then it is a TBT measure. And TBT is applicable to all industrial and agricultural products, and voluntary standards which we talked about or regulatory technical regulations. There are mandatory standards as well as voluntary standards which we talk about, and also the technical committee which forms good practices, product requirements, performance requirements, and in order to prevent descriptive characteristics or the design and descriptive characteristics also can be prescribed. So, all the central governments and the subsidiaries governments should, or local governments also, to notify these technical barriers. So, it means that it is applicable to the whole territory. We saw this particular figure in the SPS class. So, here you compare it to the SPS measures and the TBT measures, you can see that almost double. If SPS measures taken by the members are around 32,370, at the same time the TBT measures are 49,215. All the numbers are more. The TBT cases, TBT the measures, trade measures concerned are also 791, and the disputes 57 came, but you can see that most of the disputes are settled through the negotiations, through consultations. Only 10 disputes came to the WTO panel and appellate body. On vis-a-vis, there are 14 numbers came to the SPS cases came to the dispute settlement body of WTO. So, when we compare these two, you can see that the TBT measures are more. It is technical regulations are questioned, reported to the more number of technical regulations are questioned or reported to the committee on technical barriers to trade rather than to the committee on SPS. So, you can see here the trend what is happened from 1995. So, you can see the largest regulations, the largest number of TBT notifications are made in the recent past. You take the last one decade, the largest number, the 2020 is up to only July, and I am very sure that the 2020 onwards the data available are maybe higher than 2019. So, you can see the pandemic period, the members have adopted more number of technical regulations. From 2019 to 2023, if you take the more number of regulations come into place mainly because of the pandemic. And I would say that for the last one decade, the number of notifications are going up like anything. Even some years it is going up to 3,000 and 2019 is the highest with 3,337 is TBT regulation notifications to the WTO. So, it means the members are very much concerned about technical regulations. They are notifying, they are adopting, they are taking TBT measures and reporting it to the WTO. So, more number than the SPS measures. Here we can see the very important TBT disputes. So, around 57 disputes came to the WTO, but very few cases are went to the panel and appellate body. And these some of the very important cases are, which you can see that in the jurisprudence, the WTO dispute settlement jurisprudence itself, these cases are very important. EC asbestos case, where the health concerns are first discussed, then EC sardine case, which we saw this case, then tuna dolphin case, US tuna 2 case, Mexico, then US coal case, then EC seal products, then US clove cigarettes, the health concerns of cigarettes, and clove cigarettes and menthol cigarettes was discussed in this particular case. So, the menthol cigarettes is export from Indonesia is discussed in this particular case. Then again Australia tobacco plain packaging, then Russia railway equipment, and that was one of the latest cases. So, you can see there are few cases, and I would say that the EU beef hormone case is not only an SPS case, and the biotech case as well includes TBT as well. So, these are the very important cases within the TBT agreement. So, the basic principles, transparency, which we talk about every WTO agreement, openness, impartiality, effectiveness, coherence, development dimension, these are the general principles which is included in TBT agreement as well. And most importantly, you can see that the TBT agreement, it form a good practices, code of good practices. So, it talks about code of good practices for the preparation, adoption and application of standards in Annex 3 to the agreement. So, every central government must adopt a good practices, code of good practice, and they should implement at the local government level as well, and the bodies, the local bodies also to implement this. So, and you can see that the standardizing bodies play a very important role in making this particular, that means the domestic authorities are also play a very crucial role in making this code of good practice. And the code of good practice, so the GRPs to the life cycle of TBT measure, which you can see that here. So, the government interventions, monitoring, review and preparation, identifying the alternative ways and assesses alternatives, then TBT notification to WTO or proposed regulation. So, you make a regulation, so publish it and then you report it to the WTO committee and then take comments into account, then publish the final regulation and notify the final text and then enter into force and notification, finally, the WTO additional information. So, you can see the adoption of the yellow color, the adoption of how the regulatory life cycle of the TBT measures are adopted by the countries at their domestic level. So, quickly let me see some of the examples of SPS and TBT measures. Is regulation on permitted fertilizer, regulation on permitted fertilizer residue in food and animal feed, because it is related to food and animal feed. So, it is an SPS measure. So, the specifications to ensure fertilizer works effectively, it is a TBT. Every fertilizer packet contains certain prescriptions, that is a TBT measure, and to specifications to protect farmers from possible harm from handling fertilizer, it is a TBT measure. And also food labeling, certain food labeling will come under SPS. For example, permitted food safety, health warning, use, dosage, etc., that is SPS. At the same time, size, construction, structure, safe handling is a TBT measure. And with regard to fruits, the treatment of imported fruit to prevent pest spreading is an SPS measure, but the quality, grading and also labeling or is a TBT measure. Bottled water, many times the bottled water is under controversy. So, materials which can be used because safe for human health, because you directly drink, it is an SPS measure, and the residue, infectant and contaminated, the requirements, again the requirements for this the bottled water SPS measure, but the size of the bottle, the volume is a TBT measure, shape, displaying, stacking, etc. is a TBT measure, and every cigarette packets there is a health warning, and even size of the packet, it is a TBT measure. Then again if you compare this with 2, you can see within the SPS measures, typically it deals with additives in food or drink, contaminants, poisonous substances in food or drink, residues in veterinary drugs, certification, food safety, animal or plant health, then processing methods with implications for food safety, labeling requirements directly related to food. Remember, labeling in general will come under the TBT, but specifically with regard to food, it is SPS, and plant animal quarantine, SPS, declaring areas free from pest or disease or virus, it is SPS measure, and the preventing disease or pest from spreading to a particular country is also SPS measure, and then other requirements of import. So, for example, transport of animals is a SPS measure. At the same time, if you look into the TBT measures, you can see that labeling of food, drink, grading, packaging, regulations of electrical appliances, the mandatory regulations, the voluntary regulations, textile and garment labeling. So, phones, radio, other electronic equipments. For now, for example, electronic equipments, emission standards are mentioned in vehicles, TBT measure, safety regulations for toys, all these will come under the TBT measure. So, technical regulations we can look into, technical regulation is the TBT measure, technical regulation, standards and conformity assessment procedures. So, we can very clearly say that the technical regulations, the product technical regulations, characteristics, process, production methods, compliance is mandatory. So, they may deal with symbols, packaging, marking, labeling requirements. So, related to food, it is completely, it may be an SPS measure or TBT measure, but in general packaging and labeling is a TBT measure. When it comes to the standards, you can see the international standards which you can definitely see, product related standards or process related standards, and again it is compliance is mandatory, and then again labeling requirements will come, and conformity assessment procedures, CAPS, conformity assessment procedures, and every central government is responsible for the conformity assessment procedures to be at the central level as at the local government level as well. So, you can see the between these two difference between these two. When we look into international standards, we have already discussed about the 3 sisters. So, the Codex Alimentarius Commission, OIE and also International Plant Protection Agency. So, these are the 3 agencies which form the international standards, and the TBT agreement, which we can see that there are 2 types of standards which can be under the TBT, and one is the mandatory or compulsory standards and other one is voluntary standards. I have already given examples of compulsory standards like ISI mark for electrical equipments. Voluntary standards, for example, the star, how many stars are there in the AC or in a washing machine, these are voluntary standards, and also other measures which you can see that safety, energy saving mechanisms and shape of food, cartons, we talk about packaging, and pharmaceutical restrictions, labeling restrictions, for example, cigarette packets, warnings, all this will come under the TBT agreement. And basically these all testing and certification procedures are necessary. Testing, that is why every year you go to a pollution testing agency to test your emissions and get a certificate. Labeling of cigarettes is mandatory. Nutritional contents of label, in a food packet is mandatory, and with regard to plastic it is mandatory. So, you can see the certification marks. So, I think we have discussed about the measures, various TBT measures, or when compared with the SPS measure. So, here the difference between the both agreements are also which we already discussed. So, most importantly you can see that the SPS agreement which talks about the food standards or it is the health standards, and the TBT agreement which talks about technical standards. And you can find a standard or special and differential treatment provision. So, it says that particular attention to the provisions of agreement concerning developing country members rights and obligations, and shall take into account the special developmental, financial, trade needs of developing country members when they consider about TBT agreement. So, you can find the special and differential treatment provision in each and every WTO agreement, but the only question is whether the developed countries are going to give special and differential treatment to any developing countries, which we cannot find it. So, if you look into the principles for development of international standards, so it talks about 6 principles of standards. The one which talks about openness, then impartiality and consensus, transparency, the development dimension, effectiveness and relevance, and most importantly coherence. So, all these are the components of transparency, and which was, and definitely these 6 principles was is developed by the TBT committee. So, in the development of international standards in TBT agreement. So, the transparency, it is very clear what is to notify and what is not to notify. All draft technical regulations to be notified, international standards to be notified, technical regulations is to be notified. So, any measure which affect SPS or TBT measure to be notified by each member country as a part of transparency. If you look into the even there is time frame for publication of the TBT measures. So, it can be from 60 days to 6 months time, reasonable time is given to every members to notify these particular measures. So, I would say that technical barriers to trade agreement is an important agreement, goes along with SPS agreement to protect or to preserve the technical standards, especially labeling and packaging standards and other standards, especially focus is on technical standards and regulations. So, here you can see that yes, India has complied with the TBT agreement and also taken care of the TBT agreement. So, food safety is always a concern for India, because the more number of consignments are rejected by showing food safety, not only the food safety standards SPS measures, but also the TBT measures as well. So, it is very pertinent to increase the standard of food safety and also the technical regulations in the country, and this in the coming days it is going to determine the future of exports from India. So, it means that the government of India has to implement the TBT measures in very strict in the country. So, we will see the implementation in India of this particular agreement in the next class, because it is very important to see the implementation of these both agreements in India as well. Thank you.